Dear Simon and your hopefully forgiving team, my story is set at a boys' school in Lincolnshire. Let's call it Bash Street Secondary Modern. It's the late 80s and the early 90s, and I believe I can now confess this story safely, as my old headmaster, Mr. Dyke, sadly passed away earlier this year, so cannot punish me or my friends. Interesting how a headmaster from all those years back, and still Glyn is thinking, he might reach me from there. Mr. Dyke was an old-school headmaster, firm but fair, and everyone feared him and loved him in equal measure. Thankfully, the days of corporal punishment had long since passed when this incident took place, but Mr. Dyke had an index finger made of steel, and he would jab you in your ribs with every syllable as he shouted in his strong Yorkshire accent,
Yes, here it comes.
Hey up, go on.
I'm not going to do that because you know the rules. I'm not going to do it.
Oh, hey.
Anyway, he would shout as he jabs me with his finger, "You boy, you're a toe rag!" By the way, Glyn, you spelt toe wrong. And if Mr. Dyke saw this, you get the finger in the ribs, definitely. Ours was a rough school, Father Simon. In fact, it was the roughest in the area. The only school we didn't argue and fight with was the local girls' school. This wasn't because they were girls, but because they made St. Trinian's look like a convent. Our nemesis, however, was just down the road from us. The toffs and the brainiacs at the local grammar, St. Custard's.
Really? Oh, that's very funny.
Well,
oh no, of course it's from Thingy, isn't it?
It's from Back in the Jug Again, Nigel Molesworth.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we got Bass Street versus St. Custard's.
Yeah, well,
that's where we're placing this. On the morning of the event, myself and my two best friends, Wayne and Stuart, were on the school fields enjoying break and trying to avoid the fifth years because no one likes their head being shoved down the toilet after all, because that's what used to happen at every break. Well, it's Bash Street Secondary Modern.
Yeah, it sounds like it. That's fun.
Different
One way,
times.
you don't have to wash your hair soften.
After a while, we heard an unusual noise. We listened again, and it was definitely very unusual. It went like this. We looked around, and then we looked up, and we saw a large red and blue Wessex helicopter flying over the school and begin to circle after a couple of times. Anyway, then Stuart began to, do what? Well, in his head, anyway, he was doing exactly what air traffic controllers do and advised the pilot to come and land near the school in a field just over there, look. In reality, Stuart was waving his arms as though he was being attacked by a swarm of bees, but pointing to a patch of field. Being the smart and responsible one of our group, I decided that it was just a great idea and joined in, followed by Wayne, and not long after, the entire school, all pointing at the field. Hi, yes, there. Just a bit of harmless fun, we thought. That was until an arm came out of the cockpit with a thumbs up, and the helicopter circled for the last time and landed exactly where we had been pointing. At this point, Mr. Dyke burst through the school doors and made his way over to the helicopter at quite a speed, huffing and puffing as he ran. Crimson and flustered, Mr. Dyke was met by a burly man that, from our feeble peering positions, seemed to be preventing Mr. Dyke from getting any closer to the aircraft. Lots of shrugging and wild hand gestures followed, but this quickly changed to hands over his mouth from Mr. Dyke and then a somewhat submissive head-bowing posture. The muscly crew member stomped back into the aircraft, and shortly after, the helicopter took off as quickly as it had landed. Mr. Dyke, meanwhile, shuffled back into the school, looking pale and aghast. Not his usual boisterous, finger-pointing self at all, we thought. Clearly, something hugely embarrassing had occurred, and he weakly gestured and muttered for all the staff to follow him. Surprisingly, the event was not mentioned for the rest of the day, apart from hushed whispers between students shuffling through the corridors. Mainly at how Mr. Dyke had practically run away from the helicopter back into school. This was very, very unlike him. The next day we all piled into assembly, and Wayne, Stuart and I sat there, guiltily looking at our shoes. Mr. Dyke's voice boomed and rattled throughout the school hall as he demanded to know which toe rag, again spelt wrong, had started the pointing and directing the aircraft to land. There was complete silence, and thankfully for us, nobody seemed to know who had started it. They'd just seen everybody else do it, and so they joined in. Mr. Dyke's face set in a deep frown, accepting that no one was going to own up, and he solemnly began, "Boys, that's all of you boys, pay attention. from Yorkshire, remember? I need you to understand the extent of the humiliation that you have brought on the school.
This is your head teacher voice, isn't it? Yeah.
This wasn't fun. This wasn't clever. Was it reckless? Yes, it was. Yes, it was, boys. It was reckless. Let me tell you that you hailed a helicopter and it landed. And the helicopter you lot thought would be so funny to get involved in our school was carrying no other than His Royal Highness Prince Charles.
Hey.
The Prince of Wales, the Duke of Cornwall, the Duke of Rothesay. You hailed the actual heir to the throne who landed in our field thinking he was expected. Was he expected? No, he wasn't. You see, Father Simon and the Ever Gracious Collective, I was riffing there just a little bit. Going off script.
Yeah.
Good.
It turns out that the Prince was on a visit to St Custard's down the road.
Ah, but he was.
However, the pilot had got a little confused, so when these helpful children had started guiding him, he followed their instructions. So I hereby plead for forgiveness for my friends and myself, not from Mr. Dyke, who I think after he calmed down quite liked the fact that we got one over the grammar school. I also don't seek forgiveness from the grammar school, nor from Prince Charles, who I'm sure would have had a much more enlightening time if he had stayed with us. However, I would like to apologise to the pilot, who, because of us, no doubt, got a right royal telling off. Which is probably quite likely if you think you land in completely the wrong place just because a bunch of kids are saying, hey, land here. That'd be a good thing. Anyway, that's Glyn's confession. Sister Bobby, what are you thinking at the moment?
Oh, well, I'm thinking actually it's nobody to blame, really. I was sitting there thinking it's the pilot, I understand. He's going to a school and he's not sure which school. Well, he's, he gets a rough idea where he's going. He's going to a school. He doesn't know that there are two...
You can have a rough idea. You've got to land properly.
Well, yeah, but like I said, it's kind of easy. From the pilot's point of view, I understand. I don't blame the pilot. I don't blame the headmaster. I don't blame I don't blame the children. I think they're just having fun. That's fine. It seems to me like a jape that actually there were no victims. I think it was fine. They might have wasted some fuel. No one was injured. Headmaster, actually, Mr. Dyke. I love Mr. Dyke. He sounded like he ran a really tight ship, but also had a sense of humour. So I'm going to say, Glyn, it's easy to forgive you because actually I forgive everybody. No one to blame.
What a pushover. Exciting times at Bash Street Secondary Modern. What do you think of
Oh, well, I'm going to take issue with you there, Bobby, about Ironfinger Dyke. I think if anyone was reckless, it was him approaching a helicopter with the blades turning. Has anyone you've seen Apocalypse Now? You wouldn't do that.
True.
He did.
Very true.
I mean, absolutely. He'll be getting his surfboard out next and ramming the beach.
Oh,
Absolutely.
There you go,
So
yeah.
but there were three schools. There was the girls' schools. There were toughies. There was St Custard's and the Bash Street. So, I mean, the pilot, well, he wasn't to blame. But so you definitely weren't to blame, Glyn. And who wouldn't, a boy or girl, bring in a helicopter? Of course you would. That's what you put on this planet to do, aren't you? Aren't you?
I'll take your word on that, Matthew.
Yes, only Nige can get an Apocalypse Now reference into that. Superb, well done. Obviously, we're going to forgive here because, the kids were just pointing at a field. You don't just land because a bunch of kids are telling you to pointing at a particular field. And don't helicopters, surely they've got sat-nav? Something the equivalent of sat-nav, even in the 80s. Come on. And how are they going to spot which school was the right school otherwise? No idea. So not adding a lot here. I am going to forgive.